Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers, de pays étrangers.
This is the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martineau. Now, a while ago, I came across a presentation on YouTube that was titled How I Learned About My Earliest Connection to Fort Western. And I gotta be completely honest, at the time this lecture was first brought to my attention, I didn't know anything at all about Fort Western, and I wasn't really sure why a lecture about some fort in Maine was being passed around in Franco-American circles. So, of course, after seeing the lecture, I knew we had to reach out and speak with the person who gave that presentation. Paul Lessard was born and raised in Augusta, Maine, where he lived in the Sandhill neighborhood for nearly 50 years. He attended the University of Maine at both Orono and Augusta campuses, where he studied history and political science. He's currently retired, following a career in sales. Paul has been published in The Forum, a publication we've spoken about quite a bit on this show. He was a former member of the Old Fort Western Board of Trustees, and he is a member of the Calumet Club, an organization we spoke briefly about in the past, but which I'm very much looking forward to talking more about today. Now, Paul, welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
My honor. Thank you for having me.
Now, first, let me get your story a little bit. So I mentioned you grew up in Augusta, Maine. Now, what did the Franco-American experience look like at all in Augusta when you were growing up?
I grew up in a neighborhood that was probably 95% French. We spoke French when I was a kid. English only came into play, I think, in the neighborhood after television became available to most people in the mid-50s. And other than that, my dad had been president of the Calumet Club the year that I was born. It was founded in 1922 in order to preserve the Franco-American heritage and language. Quite honestly, I joined the club. I was able to speak French. I still am able to speak French, although it has been years and years since I did, so I have to really think about it. Yeah. But nonetheless, the neighborhood that I grew up in was French. I worked in Lewiston in my adult life, and I heard French spoken in Burger King when I would go to lunch with the older folks. I guess I consider myself an older folk. My brother lived in Manchester for a while. He went to college in Manchester. Nice. And he spoke French. He was very well aware of how French had dominated a mill town of Manchester. And that's one of the things that probably surprises people, that Augusta, despite being the state capital, was also a mill town. Sure. And that's how the French people came to Augusta. There were many mills to work in: textiles, shoe shop, paper mill, you name it. I mean, my grandfather was 15 years old in 1895. And his family, 7 siblings, his father and mother, they came out of Saint-Joseph-de-Beauce, moved to Augusta. Very similar to whatever happened in Manchester and Lowell and Rhode Island. Sure. A million French people moved down here, and my family was one of them.
That's awesome. Now, did you go to school in French?
I went to school in grammar school. I went to St. Augustine School, and half the day was in French, half the day was in English. And so it was part of our heritage, never gave a second thought. Right. My older brothers, 9 and 10 years older than me, did the same thing. They probably spoke French more than I did. But, it was part of that culture. It's not like that anymore.
It's a little different. Yeah, no question. Now, I would like to talk about the Calumet Club a bit. You talked about the history of the club and why the club was founded. What does the club do now?
Well, the club, I do the newsletter. Since I retired, I can do graphics. Sure. And so I do the newsletter. I'm well aware of the French language, so I interject as much of it as I can despite the fact that probably the younger members have a hard time speaking French. But its purpose is still the same. It is about to come through its 100th anniversary,
That's awesome.
which may be the end of the French heritage culture, mostly because the population has dwindled. Taking my family, probably typical. Everybody went to college and everybody
Sure.
moved away.
Right.
So it was not unusual for that to happen. Very seldom did you get a third generation, certainly not a fourth generation. They anglicized themselves. That happened on my mother's side. My mother's family was from a rustic county in Madawaska,
Sure.
and my great great grandfather was in the legislature, and he passed a bill to get an English school established in Madawaska, which
Oh, wow.
I guess when you look at it, it was the beginning of the end.
We should have talked with him, yeah.
But until that time, his purpose there was to Americanize. They use that word in the description of the bill, to Americanize his neighbors, and that's really what moving into a society. I mean, we all assimilate,
Sure.
and that's what happened with the Franco-American population in Augusta.
No, but you guys still do have events. Obviously, you got a newsletter.
We do events. We do the newsletter, monthly newsletter. We do semi-annually, or however you describe, biannually, a Festival de la Bastille,
Nice.
which shows the Franco-American culture in music and different types of art forms.
That's awesome.
And this year, for the first time, instead of having it on the Calumet Club grounds, it will be in the site of the former textile mill, Edwards Mill.
Oh, that's great.
And basically, it will actually have a bigger audience because it will be at the end of the downtown area. Not sure what's going to happen out of that. Very similar, I guess, to La Calmesse in Biddeford, or
Sure.
we're constantly changing. I don't know what's going to happen in the next 10 years. We've survived this long. I'm not sure that there are more reasons for people to move from Canada to Augusta, but nonetheless, it's very similar to Manchester. My son lived there for a little while, and he worked in a former mill that became an office building.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. I do too, in fact.
I owned a sign company, and I actually did the sign for the company that he worked for.
That's awesome.
And it blew my mind because in high school I worked at Bates Manufacturing for a couple of years. To walk in that mill in Manchester, that took me back. Big open room with
Sure.
wooden posts and wooden floors. It was interesting. It was very much the same as what I grew up with.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think it's pretty neat. In fact, I'm coming to you right now from what was Mill Housing here on Mechanic Street in Manchester. I did want to talk about that presentation you gave. I thought it was super, super interesting. Because you give the kind of the story of your family. You tell the story of the fort, and you introduce some characters through the narrative of your family story, which I thought was really, really cool. So first of all, how did you get your family story? Because you go all the way back to France.
Well, my family actually was one of the early settlers in Quebec province. My, I don't know, ninth great grandfather.
A lot of greats here.
Yeah, he was one of the early settlers. He came from Normandy, obviously. He came from a farming background. He was not going to be wealthy. He was just going to be a farmer if he stayed there. And they had the opportunity to do something more with their lives by crossing the Atlantic and going in and being a settler. And he did that. He was one of the first 500 settlers in Quebec. He married the daughter of the treasurer of Quebec. So he got some political pull besides.
That's a good move on his part, yeah.
Yeah, and so... he eventually became a seigneur.
That's awesome.
The king gave him some land. He never developed it. He sold it, but nevertheless, he did acquire the wealth and the fame, I guess, that he was seeking in his life. And of course, like a good Catholic, he had a huge family. Like any family, they're going to give their land to their children. But usually after the third or fourth child, they don't get anything because there's nothing left. So that's
Sure.
how Quebec kind of grew, because the remaining members of the family had to move and find new settlements. And they did. And that's how we ended up in the U.S. after a while.
That's funny. Now, when your ancestor comes over from France, leaves Normandy. What town does he settle in Quebec to begin with?
He landed in Tadoussac, which was
Sure.
a seagoing place, and he somehow acquired a shallop, a small boat, and the ocean-going crafts somehow or other, they never traveled up the St. Lawrence in the early days. It took small boats, so that was his business opportunity. His small boat brought cargo up to Quebec City and
Interesting.
Montreal, and he settled in what later became Saint Anne de Beaupre. In fact, after he was married in Quebec City, real fancy wedding because of who his wife was.
Sure.
And he was able to acquire land, probably was given to him as a wedding gift, who knows. But nonetheless, they got some land in just northeast of Ile d'Orléans. He wanted to donate the land, a portion of the land, to the church and name it after his own name, Etienne, Saint Etienne. And they didn't want to do that. They wanted to name it after Saint Anne, the mother of Mary. And so he didn't get his way. But nonetheless, when they received the land, they also changed the name of the town from what it was to St. Anne. And so he was one of the early settlers, obviously, and he gave the shore frontage, a portion of the shore frontage, to the church. And today, if you go there, you'll see a big stained glass window with his name on it, and the fact that he
awesome.
gave the land in 1658. So
Have you been up there? Have you seen
I
the church?
I didn't know any of this when I was a kid, but I learned later on, and so I decided, well, let's go take a look. And my wife and I went up, and sure enough, I was amazed. I was amazed
That's
to see
awesome.
what I saw. And his name was on a plaque on the replica of the stone church, the small stone chapel. And so there's a Lessard Family Association, which happens to be centered in Saint Joseph de Beauce, which is where my grandfather was born. So I ended up meeting those people. So somehow or other, all the pieces fell together, and I understood where I came from. And the Calumet Club was quite interesting because when they established the Festival de la Bastille, they set up a little booth to do genealogy. So they give you your family tree for
That's awesome.
$5 or whatever.
Sure.
So I said, okay, I'll do that. And then I said, this festival was lasting several days. So I said, I'll come back at the end of the week. They said, come back in a couple of hours. Your family is quite easy to find. And so I did that. And sure enough, I ended up with, I think it was 9 generations back to Etienne de Lessard. And then I ended up making a trip to France and went to visit Normandy, and it was quite interesting to find out how the name came about. Lessard is farmland, so he
Really?
was a farmer. If he had been in England, his name would have been Farmer.
Gotcha.
And so de Lessard was his actual name. And then they dropped the DE later on, a couple generations later. So it was quite good. So I passed this on to my kids and
Sure.
my brother's kids and so forth. Little family tree that
That was a worthwhile stop at that booth there for sure.
it was. It was.
Is it
Uh,
still offered? If we were to go to that event, would they still be able to provide that service?
I believe so.
That's awesome.
There is a genealogy group at the club, and just on request, they'll do something for you if you're looking for it.
That's
They
neat.
know where to look anyway.
Evidently, they can get you all the way back to France in 2 hours. They get something going for them.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That's awesome. Now, how did your family get? Because you mentioned Saint Joseph de Beauce a couple of times. How do we get from hanging out? First of all, where is that? And how do we get from Saint Anne de Beaupre to the Beauce?
Well, about 2 or 3 generations after Etienne de Lessard, like I said, the land being given to children kind of ran out, and
Sure.
these younger children had to fend for themselves, and they went down to Quebec at first, where the population was, and then across from Quebec City is Lévis, and
Sure.
what a river comes into that. It's called the Chaudière River, and if they travel up the Chaudière River, the French were trying to get that settled, so they were giving land away as long as you complied with certain rules. The king was going to give you some land.
Sure.
So that was a way for younger people without land to get land. And they were establishing settlements in Saint Joseph, in Saint George, and other places. And so 3 of the brothers, the third generation brothers, ended up down there. They had been born in Saint Anne, and so they were well connected personally to where Etienne was,
Sure.
but they settled at Saint Joseph because land was available, and that's how they got there. And of course, 3 or 4 generations later, my ancestors decided that for the opportunity, they would come to the U.S. to work. Outside of being farmers, they worked in the mills. So.
Sure. And now, did you know the ancestors that came down?
I knew my grandfather and grandmother. My grandmother's maiden name was Book,
Nice.
and they lived. Oddly enough, there were 8 children in my father's family. I obviously knew all of them,
Right.
but the fact that there were 7 siblings, my grandfather had 7 siblings. I only knew 2 of the families that. They obviously mostly were girls. There was only one other boy,
Sure.
but the names changed obviously when they got married, and I did not know who they were. And oddly enough, despite the fact that most of them stayed in the area, I didn't know who they were. My father never spoke about them,
That's interesting.
except for some of these anecdotal things, like when my brother was in the Navy and he came back and he wanted to date this one particular girl. He says, "I'm going to have this date with so and so." He says, my father says, "Be careful because she's your cousin." Like, what?
That's a good warning then.
There
Thanks,
was,
Dad.
large families.
Sure.
You're going to run into that, I guess.
That's awesome.
So I would always ask him. I says, "Can I ask this girl out?"
That's a good check for sure. You don't want that happening. But yeah, you mentioned obviously it's a big mill town at the time, Augusta. Now I know, at least for my family, they came down from Quebec via a train. There was a train that would go back and forth. How did people from the Beauce end up in Augusta? What was that journey like?
Well, the river continued up to Lake Mechanic. Then you end up with the Height of Land. And that became a trail much earlier than the Industrial Revolution.
Gotcha.
That was a trail that the Indians used. It was a traditional
Sure.
route to get to the ocean from Quebec. And so there was passage through there. You cross the height of land, you get into a couple of lakes, and those lakes had rivers that
Sure.
led out of them. And eventually you get down to the Kennebec River. And the Kennebec comes down through, from Bingham, let's say, all the way down to Augusta and then to the ocean and back. So the difficult part was from Lake Mechanic to cross the height of land until you got to what is today where Sugarloaf Mountain happens to be. But they did that. Later on, there was something called the Canada Road, where, once cars became available to people
Sure.
and transportation that way, they actually built roads. But that was probably, the turn of the 20th century, and so my ancestors, 1890s, may not have gone that way,
Sure.
but they might have. They might have followed the traditional route. Nonetheless, they might have also taken the early Canada Road through Jackman.
Gotcha. Now this is cool. Now, and your entire family, when they got to Augusta, they all ended up working in the mills, many generations.
Well, at least two generations. My father was the only one of his siblings that did not work in the mill.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he went to high school. He was a baseball player.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he was the only one to graduate from high school only because of his athletic ability. And when he
Interesting.
graduated from high school, he joined what was called the Civilian Conservation Corps in the mid 1930s,
Sure.
and he learned how to be a secretary.
Oh, wow.
He could type 80 words a minute on a manual typewriter.
That's awesome.
He worked later on. When he got out of that, a year or two later, he became a salesman at a drugstore, and then selling bread on a bread truck.
Sure.
And then eventually he owned his own grocery store at the time when neighborhood grocers was a big thing.
Sure.
And of course, 10 years later, that ended. That neighborhood grocery chain ended because supermarkets became the thing. So,
of course. I did want to talk about one thing that came up that was super, super interesting that you've written about in the forum, that you talked about in your presentation. That was the Arnold expedition. For those who might not be familiar with, what was it and how does that tie in to your family story?
Well, the route that we were talking about was something that was known to Benedict Arnold. I don't know how he knew it, but nonetheless, after the revolution started, all of the American soldiers gathered outside of Boston, probably in the Cambridge area. And this is when George Washington was first appointed the general in charge of everything.
Sure.
And Arnold approached him and he said he had a route that could be traveled and it could attack Quebec. And he felt that because the French had been taken over by the British, he felt that if they went in there with the troops to free them,
Sure.
that the French would join the revolution. And he convinced Washington, but Washington being newly appointed, he didn't dare make a decision unilaterally. He wanted other generals in his troop to make some decisions. They went along with the idea, but it killed a couple of months by the time that they sent out messengers and they got messages back. It took a couple of months. So instead of being ready to go, the war actually started in April,
Right.
but by the time they got the go ahead for this attack, it was August. And so then they started assembling men and equipment. And then they left Boston and came to what was Fort Western at the time. Fort Western was built in 1754 as part of the French and Indian War defense system. And it became the starting point of the Arnold expedition to go to Quebec and to try to take over Quebec City at the start of the American Revolution. So 1775,
Right.
before the anybody really thinks about it, that's when the revolution started.
Sure.
And so they finally got going out of Augusta in the third week of September, which meant that they were going to run into some weather problems,
For sure.
and they did. They had bateaus that were built in a rush at the last minute that were leaking. It was a very difficult thing. They had 1,100 troops, and nonetheless, Benedict Arnold went ahead and kind of bought equipment and supervised where to go and left messages for his troops as they followed him. Not all of them made it. I think that just more than half, it was like about 660, finally made it to Quebec. They, didn't pick up any new troops, except for, I know for a fact that my relative, who I wrote about, I didn't know he was related to me, but nonetheless, he signed up to go along with them at Fort Western, of all places. He was assigned to at the time, Captain Henry Dearborn's company, and that's who he served with. And they went through, and Dearborn, was got sick after crossing the height of land. They had hurricanes and snowstorms, and it was a mess. Very difficult to get through. I think that despite the fact that Benedict Arnold was, a traitor later
Sure.
on,
Right.
at this time he was definitely a hero to do what he did. Henry Dearborn got sick. I think he probably had pneumonia, because he stayed at Saint Joseph de Beauce, and fortunately for him, this Frenchman who signed up at Fort Western knew people at Saint Joseph de Beauce because he was related to them.
That's awesome.
And so, his mother was a Lessard. And the fact is that the Lessards who came from Saint Anne de Beaupre and ended up in Saint Joseph de Beauce knew his mother and knew him by at least by relationship, and so he won their support. And Dearborn was able to stay in somebody's house for a month, which is kind of unheard of when you think about it.
Right.
And he was able to recoup his health and then rejoin Arnold and his troops up at Lévis. And then the troops moved on to the battle in, actually it was at the end of the year. It was December 31st, and for a couple of reasons. It wasn't because of the weather. It wasn't because of anything like that. It was because it was the end of the year, and many of the troops, their contract to be soldiers was going to expire the next day.
Right. Yeah.
So they had to act that day. And unfortunately, the record shows that they lost the battle, and many of the troops, 300 of them, I guess, were captured. My relationship, Charles Bourget, he was captured along with Dearborn and several others in that group. That was the end of the Arnold expedition. Arnold did not get captured. He had gotten wounded, but somehow he got away. So,
Right. Now, I'm curious, how does Charles Bourget find himself in what is now Augusta in 1775 in order to jump aboard this? Do you have any idea why he's in town at the time?
The only thing I can guess, when I started looking into it, I asked the Lessard Association if they would help me, because obviously they were in Saint Joseph and they had connections in Quebec City.
Sure.
And as it turned out, they gave me two Charles Bourgets, family tree, both related to Lessards, and they were 6 years apart in age. And Charles Bourget, the one that I finally worked out who it was was 6 years old in 1759. So in 1775, he was 21, and this is when he learned English because of the English taking over Quebec.
Sure.
He was old enough when that battle happened to probably hold a grudge against the British. Then he decided, perhaps as a 20-year-old, to escape. And he went up the route and escaped down to Augusta. When the Arnold troops came through and he heard of what their mission was to recapture Quebec City,
Sure.
he got all excited as a 21-year-old to go back and defeat the British who had defeated his ancestors. So that's what I think the motivation was. And there's nothing written about it. He was illiterate, so he didn't write what his motivation was.
Sure.
But I can't imagine why someone would do that. Only that he held some hate for the victorious British and wanted to go back and win back his homeland. So
Sure.
he got the opportunity.
Now it's crazy. This story is gonna get better. Now because you mentioned that he was captured, but that is not the end of the American Revolution story for Mr. Bourget. So what happens after that time?
Because it was early in the revolution, there had not been many battles. Actually, there had not been any battles except for one, which was at Concord and Lexington.
Sure.
Typically, they would exchange prisoners, and that's exactly what happened there. Or the first group was the leaders, Henry Dearborn and whatnot.
Right.
Within several months, all the leaders were exchanged. But it took about a year before Bourget was exchanged for some other people who had been captured on the American side. So he was released, and rather than do nothing, he rejoined his group, which was now in Albany, New York, the next site of the battle. And all of a sudden, he's back in the thick of things in Albany, and
That's
there's
awesome.
a couple of battles, and he's in there. And within a couple of months, his unit from New Hampshire that he had been assigned to originally in Augusta gets part of the assignment to go to Valley Forge. So he goes to Valley Forge in
So crazy.
1777, 78. Yeah. So, here's a guy who, born in Quebec, signs up in Augusta, and, he's involved in some of the most notable battles or events in the American Revolution up to Valley Forge. And after Valley Forge, he was in one of the early battles right after that winter, and just went on and on until he finally his term expired with the New Hampshire group, and of course he'd been exposed to other units while he was at Valley Forge, so he signs up with a group from Wethersfield, Connecticut. His enlistment with the Wethersfield group is altogether different because, of course, now he speaks French and
Sure.
English. He's illiterate, of course, but that doesn't really matter because he's there for the rest of the war. And the group that he's with, I guess, gets the name Washington's Spies. And I don't know if he was a spy because they burned all the records.
Of course.
But he was there when he got to the end of the war. His he signs up for getting a military pension, and of course the pension has to be certified by somebody.
Sure.
And so the payroll master certifies it, as well as the captain of the unit that he signed up with, who had been the major player in Washington's Spies. Now, you don't get somebody who's well known or in the inner circle George Washington attesting to your service unless he knows you.
Sure.
So there's a lot of speculation on my part, but again, there's just way too much familiarity to think otherwise. And there are no records, of course, because it was spies. So.
And to me, when I was just hearing the big scope of this gentleman's story is, to me, is wild. I mean, you talk about, you said, born and old enough to remember the conquests of Quebec, comes down, ends up in the in a fort in what is now Augusta, goes through what has become a legendarily horrific overland through backwoods Maine trip up to Quebec City, like you mentioned, brutal conditions, tons of people dying, is captured, released in time to take place in some of the battles that happened up in upstate New York, super significant. Ends up obviously in Valley Forge. Everybody knows Valley Forge. Right. And then, by the way, he happens to get caught up in a unit run by Benjamin Talmadge, who anybody who's seen the AMC show Turn Washington Spies is now familiar with. That is just a crazy life story for this gentleman that happens to be your ancestor. And I find it super, super fascinating that you were finding this. That was awesome.
You know, it was so weird that this came about because I ran across the name being misspelled in Dearborn's journal when I was, I don't know, a sophomore in college. I was doing a work study job at the Maine State Museum, and I got the assignment to write a report on Fort Western because I was from Augusta. I didn't know anything about Fort Western except that I knew where it was. It was located next to Fort Western Tire on one side and Eaton Shoe on the other side.
There you go.
So the fact that they gave me the assignment, was the assumption that I knew what I was talking about. Well, I had to read a lot in a week to make a story together to do a little sales pitch for what the toy was for children. The toy was a cardboard cutout of Fort Western.
Gotcha.
And so I read Henry Dearborn's diary, and he mentions, the Arnold expedition. And I thought, well, okay, that sounds really good. But then he writes that he was accompanied by a guy named Charles Bourget, Burget. And I says, that's misspelled, because he goes further to identify him as a man born in Canada, also misspelled.
Sure.
And I'm thinking, one of these days I'm going to look this up. And it only took me 45 years before I finally got back to it. But it was well worthwhile. I think that this guy was famous only if you knew who he was. And I'm not sure that I made him famous, but I was fortunate enough to be able to get his name in the University of Maine Forum publication.
Sure.
I also was able to do a lecture at Fort Western, and I did the same lecture more or less at the annual meeting of the Arnold Expedition Group.
Oh, really? That's awesome.
And so all of the people that have an interest at least now know about it, including my family.
That's awesome.
So, it's one of those things that I'm glad I questioned the misspelling of this French guy's name. And that's funny, too, because when you look at Franco-Americans and coming from Canada to the U.S., they become Americanized, as my ancestor would have said.
Sure.
And their names get changed. And many of them, they lose their heritage because the name is gone. A couple generations later, they don't know they're French. Charles Bourget ended up with no children. He died in upstate New York on land that was given to him as payment for his service. His story would have ended there, except for, some curiosity of mine. So I'm glad I was able to do it.
Yeah, me too, very much. When I saw that story, I just thought, I mean, being a big fan of the American Revolution generally, just that you were able to find this French Canadian personal connection with this
Mm.
amazing story was so neat. I'm very glad you've been able to share it. This has been way fun. Now, what are you working on now? You got any future research projects in the works?
I really don't. It's just one of those things. I mean, I've just come off some health issues. I'm just trying to get my mind wrapped around remembering who I am.
All
But
right, we'll have to figure something out then.
it would be fun to find another project. And like I said, I do the newsletter for the Calumet Club, which keeps me in touch with my heritage and
Sure.
probably helps me promote the heritage to a mass group of descendants who probably don't know as much as I do. I don't know. I think we're all in the same boat, whether you're living in Augusta or Manchester or Lewiston.
Sure.
Couple generations down, it gets lost. It's very, unless there's a museum, which there is in Lewiston. There's one in Manchester. There is no museum.
Woonsocket's got a really good one.
Yeah, there is no museum in Augusta. I don't know what happened to Augusta, but being the state capital probably worked against it because in your case, when I exposed you to the fact that there were so many Franco-Americans here,
Right.
it was a surprise.
Absolutely. Yep.
And I'm not surprised because it was never reported on. And the mills that were here were no different than the ones in Manchester.
Sure.
But somehow or other, if the capital of New Hampshire had mills, the same thing would have happened.
Very possible. Yeah.
Boston was a mill town, but it's not treated that way. I don't know. It's just something about being the state capital that works against the heritage thing, I think.
I got you. No, that's interesting. Now, if people want to get more information on the Calumet Club and some of the things they have going on, where can we send them?
Well, the Calumet Club has a website. That would be calumetclub.com. I would be glad to put you in touch with a couple of people that understand the history of the Calumet Club and probably would give you better details than I could. And I will do that. I will make sure that they know who you are and make contact. But I think that Augusta deserves to be known as much as Waterville and Brunswick and
Biddeford, yeah.
Biddeford. It is, or was, I should say, it was a mill town.
Sure.
It's no longer a mill town. However, there were textile workers at Bates Manufacturing, probably 1,600, and I would say 1,200 of them were migrants, and they came from someplace else. And I worked there in high school. Like I said, my father was the only one that didn't work there in his family, but it was a way for somebody coming off the farm to get a job.
Sure.
And and my grandfather and his siblings all ended up owning houses and doing whatever. It was just a natural thing to do, and it worked. And the next generation, my father, moved on, and his children, like I said, they all went to college.
Sure, that's awesome.
So that's what happens. I think we're no different a story than the ones in your town. So
that's very cool. Well, we have been joined by Paul Lessard telling us a little bit about the Augusta story and one of the craziest, most fun American Revolution stories I have ever heard because it involves a really interesting French-Canadian gentleman. Paul, thank you so much for joining the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Thank you for this opportunity. Appreciate it.
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.